Thank you very much for having me. I really appreciate this very much. I may be the first philosopher who's spoken to your organization. I'm not sure, but we'll see. Is the mic all right? Sound all right? Everyone can hear me? All right. So I want to thank Dirk and Kathy and everyone here who's made my time here so nice, organized. Thank you very much. It's wonderful. So the title of my talk today is The Real Enemy of Truth These Days Isn't Misinformation, It's Disinformation. We hear a lot of talk these days about how truth is threatened in the age of misinformation. I understand that misinformation is a terrible problem and that it has downstream effects on science, trust, institutions, society, and just about everything else that we care about. But I think the real enemy of truth is properly labeled, not misinformation, but disinformation. Now, I understand who I'm talking to here today. As information scientists, you're at the cutting edge of this problem. You're out there every day trying to figure out how to navigate the polluted information stream. Even if someone has the truth right in front of them, how will they know it? The problem isn't just access anymore. It's about how to tell the difference between good and bad sources in real time without getting fooled too often, in an environment in which tons of people are trying their best to fool you. I wonder if you remember the scene in the movie Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade. At the end of the movie, Indiana's journey is almost done and he's finally confronted with the Holy Grail. Except he can't tell which one it is because it's surrounded by 100 fakes. That's what we're up against, and that's the goal of disinformation. If you can't hide or destroy the truth, you can surround it with bullshit. When people look back, they talk about the Iron Age and the Bronze Age, the Renaissance and the Industrial Revolution. And surely our own age will be called something like the Information Age or maybe the Misinformation Age. It's hard to predict these things when you're too close to it. But here's something that future generations will surely see, which far too few people these days are willing to acknowledge. We are right now in an information war. Some people think that the best route to truth is always to seek more information. One problem, though, is surely information overload. Even if you're surrounded by good information, how do you wade through it? But now add the problem of people who are intentionally trying to deceive you by making their lies look as good as possible, and you've got a monster of a problem. We've all seen the horrible consequences of this in recent years, most recently during the infodemic that accompanied the pandemic. Where could people get reliable information about the vaccines? And why did so few people trust science all of a sudden? Where was all of the fake information coming from? And why was it getting amplified so fast? And the answer is that it was intentional. This is something that a lot of folks in the media still miss. The problem these days is not merely falsehood, it is intentional falsehood. It's one thing to have to sort through mistakes, it's worse to have to sort through lies. And that's the real danger. In recent years, information has been weaponized as a tool of war, both foreign and domestic. The distinction between misinformation and disinformation is the most important thing to keep in mind when trying to help people in the information sphere. And let me just explain a bit. Misinformation is a mistake. It's when we say that some falsehood is true when it's not, but this happens by accident. Suppose I'm out walking my dogs and a passing car stops and asks for directions to Boston. I say, go down 3 blocks, make a left, and get on Beacon Street. That'll take you straight to Boston. Easy enough, and the person happily pulls away. Then to my mortification, I realize that I'm not where I thought I was, and I've told him to go exactly the wrong way. I said to make a left on Beacon, I should have said right. Now he's going to be headed out to Wellesley, and if he keeps going, eventually the New York border. I made a mistake, but it wasn't malicious. That's misinformation. Now imagine by contrast that I intentionally wanted to misdirect someone because I had a gang of friends who were waiting to carjack a Mercedes. And I took this opportunity to give the motorist directions that would lead him directly to them so that they could take his car, chop it up, and sell it for parts. In this case, perhaps I might also have told him to go left rather than right, but now it's disinformation because I did it on purpose. I did it to serve my interests, and the motorist believed the falsehood. And that's where the whole thing is relevant for our situation today. Throughout my talk, I'm going to use science as a proxy for accurate, truthful information, because I've spent the better part of a decade studying the problem of science denial. And I think it turns out to be quite illuminating for thinking about the problem of false information and truth in general. I maintain that the reason we live in an age in which there's so much science denial about the climate, COVID, and so much else, and where we've witnessed such rapidly diminishing trust in science, is not because it's some sort of accident or mistake that false information is leaking out onto the internet. It's instead the result of a deliberate campaign of deception and falsehood that someone cooked up to mislead us. There are forces at work who want us to believe false things about the climate and COVID, about evolution and vaccines and GMOs, not because it serves our interests, but because it benefits the interests of the people who are creating and spreading these falsehoods. Science denial is not an accident, it's a lie. People don't wake up one day wondering whether the California forest fires were due to a Jewish space laser, or whether Bill Gates put microchips in their COVID vaccines. Those are the result of a propaganda campaign that's meant to create doubt and distrust. Of course, to the person who's going in the wrong direction to Boston, you might wonder why it's worse that the mistake was deliberate. Yet, as you can see in my original example, it's because the consequences can be quite terrible for the person who's being misled, depending on the stakes of the lie. The difference between driving to Wellesley and turning around versus driving to Wellesley and getting carjacked is not trivial. Wellesley is not exactly a capital of carjacking, but you get the point. Imagine asking a scientist why fraud is worse than error. They'll give you a funny look. Anyone who's ever done a little science understands that it's hard enough without having to deal with people who are cheating. Of course, mistakes in science aren't really welcome either, but at least you might be able to learn from someone's error. But what's the point of building on someone else's work when even they know that it isn't true? I submit that the same thing holds with the distinction between mis and disinformation. It matters why you're driving the wrong way. But now let me make another qualification. You knew this was coming because I'm a philosopher. Couldn't you say that to the person who acts on bad information, it hardly matters what the original intent was? After all, the person who hears a piece of disinformation and then spreads it, believing it to be true, has done so without any malicious intent. So doesn't it at that point become misinformation? Now, as a philosopher, we could spend a couple of weeks sorting that out, but let's not. Because the important point I'm trying to make here is that if you want to fight bad information, you have to know where it's coming from and why. And if you're trying to defend science from science deniers and other charlatans, it's important to keep in mind not just that they believe false things, but that they believe false things because they have been lied to. That is the nub of the problem. As with most effective lies, a science denial campaign usually starts with a kernel of truth. And it employs a tactic we all think of as very good and in fact quite scientific, which is doubt. Scientists doubt things, and it's good that they do. As Carl Sagan once said, the amazing thing about scientists is that they're both open-minded and skeptical at the same time. Now, the trick is to be open-minded enough to want to learn new things that might change your mind about what's true, but suspend your judgment over any particular hypothesis until you hear the evidence for it, because you always want to test things. Doubt in and of itself is not necessarily a bad thing, because doubt about any particular scientific finding can be overcome with sufficient evidence. Indeed, this is how scientists reason. Scientists are skeptical. That's why they turn to the evidence. that the real problem comes when mere doubt morphs into distrust. For doubt can be overcome with evidence, but distrust cannot. The true goal of disinformation is not merely to raise doubt, but to weaponize it into distrust and eventually denial. This occurs when our fellow citizens are encouraged not just to disbelieve certain facts, but to distrust the scientists who have discovered them, to see them as biased or even liars, which undermines the process by which scientific knowledge is created in the first place. In an earlier book called The Scientific Attitude, I argued that what's most special about science is that scientists care about evidence and they're willing to change their mind in the face of new evidence. Although they may start with doubt, when the evidence is sufficient to overcome their reservations, a good scientist will give their assent. This is not to say that they necessarily believe that a hypothesis has been proven to be true or that we're certain about it, because those are unreachable goals. No scientist can ever prove a theory because science is not deductive logic or Euclidean geometry. But when there's sufficient evidence, it is rational to believe that a theory is true. That is until new evidence mounts to get you to change your mind. In the philosophical trade, that's called fallibilism. And it means that you are willing to give your assent to a well-corroborated belief while always holding out the idea that in the long run, it might not be true. That's a rational way to form your beliefs. It's not perfect, but it is rational. We assert what we think is true, and then we revise as necessary. I want you to compare this to the way that a science denier reasons. As Dirk said, a few years back, I went to the Flat Earth International Conference in Denver, Colorado, where I spent 2 days mingling with 650 folks who genuinely believed that the Earth was flat, that Antarctica wasn't a continent, but an ice wall around the perimeter of the Earth to keep the water from falling off, that there was a dome over the top, just outside of which were the sun, moon, and stars, and that we'd never actually been to the moon because, of course, it's impossible to get the rocket through the dome. Why did they believe this? They believed this because they distrusted scientists. It was all part of a giant conspiracy theory whereby the scientists were somehow benefiting from keeping this a secret, along with all of the astronauts, professors, teachers, and government officials in the world. So you are all benefiting from that lie, according to them, because the world is divided into either people who are in on the conspiracy or people who have the wool pulled over their eyes. But this sort of toxic commitment to a conspiracy theory, for which there is zero evidence, of course, wreaked havoc with the flat earthers' claim that their own beliefs were based on good evidence, not on faith. And because if they demanded proof as a standard of belief, you might say, well, then why did they believe in flat earth? That's what the conference was about. It was about the evidence alleged for flat earth and the evidence against the round earth. But what I discovered there is that it wasn't just about what they believed, it was why they believed it. It's not just that their beliefs were wrong, it's that they were reasoning about them in the wrong way. Nothing could convince them. They would never say what, if any evidence might compel them to change their mind, because they didn't have the scientific attitude. So it's not just that their conclusions were mistaken, it's that they were not willing to reason about an empirical matter in the way that scientists do. And the reason is that they distrusted the scientists. And here's the point. Why do you take flat earthers seriously? The point is because the form of reasoning that they use is identical to the form of reasoning that is used by anti-vaxxers and climate deniers and anti-evolutionists and any other science denier that you've ever spoken to. Some years back, a few researchers found that all science deniers reason in the same way. This is not to say the content of all their beliefs is all the same, or that if you're a science denier about one topic, you're necessarily a science denier about another topic. The flat earthers were a good example. They tended not to be climate deniers for a weird reason. It's because if you believe that you live in a terrarium, basically, you need to take care of what's underneath the bubble. So they were deniers about the shape of the earth, not about climate change. So here's how the reasoning strategy goes. Every science denier cherry picks evidence, believes in conspiracy theories, engages in illogical reasoning, relies on fake experts, and believes that science has to be perfect to be credible. This sounds familiar. These 5 tropes are the hallmark of vaccine denial. We all understand that vaccine deniers cherry pick unvetted claims from the VAERS website or rely on fake experts on the internet who sometimes have alternative cures to sell to support their spurious claims. But here's the payoff. By understanding that flawed reasoning strategy, it allows you to learn how to push back against deniers, not just by presenting the facts, which they're not going to believe, but by talking about how they're reasoning. You want to address not just the content of their beliefs, but the flawed logic behind it. Consider, for example, the 5th trope, the idea that science has to be perfect in order to be credible. This is a common belief amongst science deniers who you've heard say, just give me proof. And when you can't, they say, aha. They'll say, let's wait for more evidence on climate change, or just prove to me that the vaccines are safe. But there's never an end to evidence. You can't prove that aspirin is safe. It's not Euclidean geometry or deductive logic. They don't understand how science works. They're reasoning about empirical beliefs in an illogical way, because when you're dealing with inductive reasoning strategies, you cannot have proof. David Hume showed this hundreds of years ago. So what do? You have to rely on warrant and evidence, not certainty. To a science denier, though, they feel virtuous for their great skepticism. And in fact, they'll often say that they're the true skeptics. In the first day at the Flat Earth Conference, I kept my mouth shut and I just wanted to listen. But of course, people wanted to engage and ask me questions. I didn't want to lie to anyone. One fellow came up and he put his hand on my arm and he said, "What's your belief system?" And I said, "Well, I'm a skeptic." And he said, "Me too." Science deniers think that they're more scientific than the scientists, but they really don't understand what skepticism means. Science deniers are what I call cafeteria skeptics. They're not anti-science. They don't disbelieve all science. They disbelieve science on a few particular topics on which they have been radicalized, usually ones that step on some of their personal beliefs. My favorite example of this is the conspiracy about flat Earth puts all airline pilots in on it. Yet most of the people at the convention flew to the convention. So they obviously trusted the pilots at some point, just not about the shape of the Earth. Science deniers are inconsistent in the way that they reason about evidence. They insist on a standard of evidence tantamount to proof for the things they don't want to believe, but ask for almost no evidence at all on the things that they do want to believe. This double standard would not be tolerated in science. And I've often thought that instead of being skeptical, science deniers are actually quite gullible. It's worth reflecting on all this for a moment because it'll help us to see what we can do to fight back. There was a landmark study published in June 2019 in the journal Nature Human Behavior by Cornelia Bache and Philip Schmid, which showed that one can push back against science deniers and sometimes even convince them to give up their irrational beliefs based on understanding the 5 tropes strategy. But it's hard and it doesn't always work. It works better than anything else, but here's the kicker. It is a salvage strategy. It's what you do once somebody has already been infected. When disinformation is out there, there's a certain percentage of people who will believe it, even if you debunk it immediately. So This is what you do when the disease of denialism has already spread to a virgin population and there's nothing else you can do but to treat it. But what if you could get to the vulnerable people first, before they were radicalized? Because remember, science deniers are made. Their beliefs are created by someone whose interests are served by radicalizing them. And by understanding that, maybe we can address the problem before it gets any worse. You can stop a disease by treating the sick, but also by removing the pump handle, if you know that story, that's getting everyone infected in the first place. One way to do this is to pre-bunk the false beliefs by publicizing the flawed reasoning strategy that all science deniers use to arrive at them. It's in the Bache and Schmidt study. If you read it, they even give scripts for how to do this, how to get people to realize. But another is to expose the fact that science deniers are being duped in the first place, that they're victims, that in some sense they deserve our empathy because they're not doing their own bidding, they're doing someone else's. Don't forget where we started with this. Science denial is rooted in disinformation. It is the weaponization of doubt, which means that someone must have weaponized it. But who? The manufacture of doubt into modern science denial campaign began in the 1950s when the CEOs of the 4 largest tobacco companies met at the Plaza Hotel in New York City and hired a public relations specialist to advise them what to do about a forthcoming study which was going to show an all but definitive link between smoking and lung cancer. His advice: fight the science. They accomplished this through a public relations campaign that involved full-page ads in American newspapers, before the internet, but they reached 1/6 of the American population. They did their own research in a precursor to the American Tobacco Institute, and they created an alternative narrative of doubt that they then fed out to journalists, editors, and publishers who were encouraged to tell the other side of the story. They wanted to get the truth out that the causal link between smoking and lung cancer had not yet been proven, which was true. But that's because no causal link between any two things can ever be proven by an inductive method. The tobacco companies didn't need to prove that smoking did not cause lung cancer. All they needed to do was create enough doubt about whether it did to continue to sell cigarettes, which they did for the next 40 years. As Naomi Oreskes and Eric Conway report in their wonderful book, Merchants of Doubt, this tobacco strategy provided a blueprint for the next 6 decades of denialist campaigns about acid rain, the ozone hole, and later about climate change, so that the special interests could profit. But then a dangerous thing happened during those decades. On several topics, science denial morphed from being just about profit to being about politics, about ideology. The goal was no longer merely to make money, but to protect one's beliefs. And for that, they needed to create an army of deniers. The manufacture of doubt was no longer enough. The goal was distrust, which could be created only through the cynical manufacture of disinformation. The point of a disinformation campaign is not just to create doubt about some particular fact, but to foment alienation and polarization, to divide the world into us versus them, so that you begin to distrust the truth tellers in general. Because once that's happened, they don't need to continue with the disinformation. You don't trust a word that they say. Think about what people say about Fauci. What was his great crime? I can never quite understand, but he's apparently supposed to be guilty of some terrible thing. After all, what use are facts if you don't trust the people who are providing them? Consider for a minute vaccine denial. If it were motivated merely by doubts about whether the vaccines caused infertility, it could be overcome by data showing that it did not. But if you look how people came to such suspicions, it's because they've been fed propaganda that encourages them to think that Dr. Fauci and the CDC and the FDA were lying to us. When you enter a world where the skeptics become us and the scientists become them, the battle is half lost, because at that point, the facts don't really matter. Because why would you believe anything if it was shared by a liar? In April 2020, just a month into the pandemic, a story appeared in a publication called the Oriental Review, which claimed that any future COVID vaccines developed in the West would have biometric microchips in them, courtesy of Bill Gates, who had taken out patent number 666 on this technology. At the bottom of the article were buttons to make it easy to share this story on Facebook and Twitter, which people did. What was not immediately apparent from the story, though, is that the Oriental Review is one of 4 English language propaganda arms of the GRU, which is the Russian intelligence service that is devoted to disinformation. How many of you already knew that before I just said it? 3 people. The rest of you, bravo to you. For the rest of you, it's not your fault. But it is stunning that that story didn't get more traction. You did not need to break into CIA headquarters to find out that this was true. It was in the Wall Street Journal, but it was behind a paywall, and it was a one-day story because it never got picked up on any of the cable news channels. It was picked up on a couple of other places. But if you Google that to this day, you don't see that many places picked it up. But that is a stunning story, isn't it? Think about how many people died during the COVID pandemic and how many of them believed that there were microchips in their vaccines. We'll never know how many, but surely people died as a result of that very successful disinformation campaign. This was not the first time that Russia's been involved in creating and disseminating disinformation that undermined Western confidence in science and topics such as climate change, AIDS, GMOs, vaccines before COVID, and a host of other health-related topics. There was a terrific article in the New York Times a few years back entitled "Putin's Long War Against American Science," which tells the story of how Putin's Russia has for decades been trying to undermine Western scientific institutions. The story about microchips was just the latest in a long line of disinformation that's been intended to destabilize the West. Interesting part about that is they did such a good job that many Russians wouldn't take their vaccines. The Sputnik 5, think about that, the new race, the Sputnik 5 vaccine, they overshot. By May 2020, CBS News reported on a poll which showed that 22% of Americans believe that any COVID vaccines might have biometric microchips in them. Now, I prettied that up a little bit. It was 44% of Republicans. That's quite a payoff for 1 month's propaganda. And you know the rest of the story from here, or do you? Now, I am not saying that all scientific disinformation on the internet has come out of a Russian troll farm, but I am saying that some of it did, and that most of us didn't know it. And the purpose of this is to exploit existing fault lines in Western society to keep us at each other's throats so that we're less likely to have the time and resolve to pay attention to what other countries like Russia are doing. Given the political climate that we've all just lived through and are still living through to some extent, it's not hard to see how the politicization of science denial has now become a weapon, and worse yet, an example that has blazed the trail from science denial now to reality denial about topics that reach far beyond science all the way to the foundations of American democracy. I'm talking here about election denial, which follows the same 5-step pattern. It is a dangerous moment in history, and the stakes are high. If we cannot figure out what to do about the problem of disinformation in this country and around the world, a number of our treasured institutions may be at stake. I'm really depressing you during your lunch, aren't I? I will offer some better news in a moment. I submit that part of the answer in how to fight back is that we have to learn how to talk to one another again. In my book, How to Talk to a Science Denier, I recommend a strategy for respectful conversation with those who are distrustful of science. Basically, if people don't trust you, the best way to build trust is face-to-face. But that's only part of the solution. It's what we do when people have already been infected in the infodemic. But I think, especially since writing that book, that we also need to figure out how to stop the flow of disinformation so easily on the internet, where it's picked up and amplified by those with nefarious intent. What we really have before us, I think, are 3 problems. We have the creation of disinformation, we have the amplification of disinformation, and we have the uptake of disinformation. If you can figure out how to stop a propagandist from creating disinformation, I am all ears. As we've seen, some of it comes from overseas, so it's not even a question of trying to regulate it or punish it legally. Likewise, once disinformation is out there in the world, empirical studies have shown that it just will have a negative influence, as I've said. No matter how good you are at debunking, once falsehood is present in the information stream, a statistically significant number of people will become infected by it, especially if it confirms something that they already wanted to believe. I've always thought that amplification is the key point in the disinformation highway. If we're going to solve the problem, I think this is where we're going to solve it. Even if we can't stop the creators from making disinformation or the believers from believing it, maybe we can put a kink in the supply chain between these 2 points. Without a means of amplifying a propagandist message, disinformation is essentially useless. But just a little amplification can have a devastating impact. According to a 2021 study put out by the Center for Countering Digital Hate, 65% of the anti-vax propaganda on Twitter was due to 12 people. In an internal study, Facebook found that 111 of their accounts were spreading half of the anti-vaccine information on their site. These small numbers demonstrate just how much damage can be done by a few highly motivated people and the incredible reach of disinformation when a liar has a megaphone. The importance of Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube in spreading myths and disinformation on the internet is not in dispute. As 3 of the 5 most visited websites in the world, how could it be otherwise? But the issue is not simply how much false information is out there on these sites, but what public harm this has caused and what the companies are doing to stop it. Despite their protests to the contrary, these companies make minimal efforts to police for disinformation. Yet they love to call attention to what they have done, even if it's only minuscule in proportion to the problem. Yes, it was good when YouTube decided in 2020 to crack down on election misinformation on its site, because that had a virtuous spillover effect on Facebook and Twitter. Yes, it's good that Facebook and Twitter both began to get more serious about providing content warnings about both election and coronavirus misinformation in 2020. But this raises the question of why these companies don't do more to combat mis and disinformation on other topics all the time, because they apparently know how to do it. Now, of course, tech executives, and there may be some in this room, can be expected to bristle at this characterization, preferring to highlight the number of accounts they've closed and the number of messages they've taken down. But this always reminds me a bit of the greenwashing ads that you see on TV, where the fossil fuel companies have these beautiful commercials with happy music and people smiling, talking about all the money that they're devoting to algae and other alternative fuels, which turns out to be less than 1% of their research budget. Now, why do they do it? They do it because it makes them look good. So they're reporting their top line number, but where's the denominator? You have to dig to find out how little money they're actually spending on it. And the truth is that most social media companies do not do a very good job of policing for disinformation, likely because it's not in their financial interest to do so. In 2016, Mark Zuckerberg called it crazy to think that misinformation on Facebook might have helped Trump win the presidential election. By 2017, he admitted that more than 150 million people had viewed Russian propaganda posts on Twitter before the election. Since then, one grows tired of hearing Facebook brag that it's closed down 1.3 billion fake accounts or taken down 18 million misleading posts without an admission of how many people saw or shared those posts before they were taken down, and how many have they missed. Despite Zuckerberg's 2021 statement that Facebook has spent $13 billion on safety and security since 2016, and that it has a human team of 40,000 people scrubbing for misinformation, and they've got a new commercial about that, greenwashing commercial. This pales in comparison to the scope of the problem and the potentially horrible consequences if they don't get this right. Could Facebook and other tech companies do more to fight disinformation on their platforms? Of course they could. How do we know this? Because they already do it for other odious content. Ask yourself this: when was the last time you saw pornography, suicide, beheadings, or other acts of terrorism on Facebook? And the answer, at least outside this crowd, who may be police for it, is likely never. That's because Facebook employs a human team that scrubs for this, so it never makes its way onto our news feeds. It's got to be the worst job on Facebook, imagine. But they care enough to pay attention to it, likely because it would hurt their bottom line if they did not. So could they do the same for disinformation about the 2022 midterms that are coming up in 7 days? Could they do it for climate change? Yes, they could, if they cared to. Now, it's important to point out here that unlike partisan media outlets like Fox, Breitbart, Newsmax, and OANN, social media companies like Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube do not seem to be intentionally spreading disinformation. Most of the amplification of disinformation that happens on social media is, technically speaking, unwitting. It's literally non-human, because it's based on algorithms, which we all know are machine-based learning tools that study our preferences and respond by giving us more of what we seem to like. If that's video of dogs being befriended by ducklings, which I've seen and it's very cute, then we get more of that. But if it's content that maintains that the Democratic Party is run by a cabal of pedophiles, we get that instead. Although the algorithms used on social media are created by human beings, they work so quickly and relentlessly that in actual practice, they can take on a life of their own, which exacerbates the possibility that something might go wrong without anyone realizing until it's too late. In one recent heartbreaking example, misinformation and hate speech on Facebook set off a round of suicide bombings and executions in India, which then spilled over into a genocide of the Rohingya people in Myanmar. In response, just prior to a $150 million lawsuit by the Rohingya refugees, Facebook said that it would hire more people with language, country, and topic expertise in countries like Myanmar. Clearly, the solution, though, is not merely to play whack-a-mole with myths and disinformation as it pops up on Facebook and these other platforms. The larger problem seems to be how to anticipate and stop the algorithmic spread of propaganda on social media before its human scrubbers even detect it. But how many engineers are working on this problem at Facebook, at Twitter, etc.? No one knows, because someone knows, but no one outside the companies know, because the content of the algorithms are a secret outside the companies. In a 2021 article on the algorithmic amplification of disinformation on social media, Mark Ingram writes in Columbia Journalism Review that, quote, "The algorithms themselves and the inputs they use to choose what we see in our feeds are opaque. They're known only to senior engineers within those companies or to malicious actors who specialize in computational propaganda," end quote. Even if no human being actually intends it, automated algorithms at virtually all the social media companies seem primed to spread false information and incendiary rhetoric because they're formulated, as we all know, to maximize engagement, clicks, and time spent on the site. Rather than promote truth, they're engineered for what's most profitable. But knowing this, it is at least disingenuous for tech executives to say that these problems are entirely unwitting, because they reflect no intention to mislead, so how can they be responsible? And they want credit for simply working on the problem. As Zuckerberg once wrote, quote, "If we didn't care about fighting harmful content, then why would we employ so many people dedicated to this?" End quote. Yet the question remains, are they doing enough? Some tech insiders have pushed back against the sort of characterization that I'm making, or even the claim that there's rampant disinformation on the internet, by hiding behind the notion that most people who share false stories likely do so because they believe them to be true, which, as we've seen, technically makes them misinformation. But does that really make it any better? The origin story is still a lie. When bad actors create and or publicize a story, that they know to be false, this is of course deplorable. But when a fool picks up those lies and shares them because it triggers their amygdala, or they choose to be lazy or willfully ignorant, is that really any less dangerous? It's like the guy driving to Wellesley. In a 2021 article entitled, "Don't Blame Russian Trolls for America's Anti-Vax Problem," Sophie Zhang, a former Facebook employee, claims that the idea of Russian responsibility for disinformation on social media is overblown because most misinformation is spread by domestic sources. But even if this is true, it misses the point and goes straight to the heart of why big tech's strategy to fight misinformation on its platforms seems doomed to failure. Even if misinformation is spread authentically by people who believe it's true, the information at issue is still based on a lie. And it was because it was weaponized by propagandists who created it. When Nicki Minaj spread the bogus claim, remember this one, that COVID vaccination might lead to swollen testicles and infertility, she has 22 million Twitter followers. Shouldn't it matter whether these bogus claims might have originated from a disingenuous disinformer? I mean, she was a victim like anyone else. She just happened to have 22 million Twitter followers. She spread it thinking it was true. Doesn't make it any better. Thus, Facebook's effort to fight misinformation primarily by cracking down on inauthentic sharing, which was Zhang's job at Facebook, seems a misfire. Disinformation is no less benign because it's shared by what the Russians call useful idiots rather than Russian bots. Now, if true, perhaps it's a good thing that most of the misinformation on the internet is shared authentically by actual human beings, because this means that most of the content we'd like to crack down on isn't necessarily being amplified by the propagandist itself. If it were, just imagine the difficulty. How could you ever get them to stop? But if most is shared by the unwitting, then we have a chance. But how? So I'm going to close with some thoughts about how to address this problem. I maintain that flagging content is not enough. Even removing fake accounts and taking down misleading posts isn't enough either. Social media companies' efforts so far have been woefully adequate, not because they don't know what to do, but because there has so far been little incentive for them to do it. With no sustained external pressure, most tech companies will likely continue to fail in proportion to the seriousness of the problem. In order to stop the disinformers from succeeding, I think that we have to get more serious about fighting the amplification of misinformation and disinformation. And for that, we need to create more reason for both partisan and social media outlets to curb the role that they play in propagating polluted content. What I've outlined here is the work of an army, and it may take years to complete. But the stakes suggest that if we don't do this soon, we are in serious trouble. In recent congressional testimony, Joan Donovan, who's maybe one of the leading experts in the world on disinformation, she's the research director at the Shorenstein Center on Media Politics and Public Policy at Harvard. She put it this way, quote, the biggest problem facing our nation is misinformation at scale. The cost of doing nothing is democracy's end, end quote. The first thing we have to do to win the information war is to recognize the true nature of what we're up against. That this is not all due to misinformation. It is disinformation. Someone is doing this on purpose. We have to face up to this and not hide behind euphemisms or the reluctance to name names. Who are the disinformation dozen who have been responsible for all that anti-vax propaganda on Twitter? And why haven't all 12 of them been deplatformed yet? And I know because I checked and they are not. Some have and some have not. Some have claimed that the only cure for bad speech is good speech. That deplatforming even known liars is to interfere with the right of free expression. Except that what the First Amendment protects us against is the right not to be censored by government, not private companies. Various solutions have been proposed, ranging from bringing back the Fairness Doctrine to revising Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act, or passing legislation that mandates more transparency of social network algorithms so that they can be studied by outside researchers who don't have a financial interest at stake. And I'm sure in this room, I don't need to explain all those things because those are the things you've been talking about and having meetings about over the last few days. I simply want to leave you now with one simple thought that might guide us in thinking about what the solutions are, because this is a problem from hell, and how do you solve it? We need a guideline. I believe that free speech is not an unfettered right with no reasonable limitations. What is the 21st century equivalent of falsely yelling fire in a crowded theater? Maybe it's claiming that vaccines cause infertility. We're in the middle of a pandemic and 1 million people die. There has to be a distinction between respecting free speech and insisting that every propagandist have unfettered, immediate access to an audience of millions. Refusing to amplify disinformation is not censorship. We are in an information war, and you do not win an information war by refusing to disrupt the lies of your opponent. In fact, the first step to winning an information war is to admit that we're already in one. That's it. So I have said some things that I know are going to be unpopular because I've sat in some of your sessions, and I'm ready for questions. Would you like me to field my own questions, or would you like to? Okay. But I am ready.
Hi, Dr. This is on. Dr. McIntyre, my name is Naresh Agarwal. I'm a professor at Simmons University in Boston and an almost past president of ASIS&T. And
a few more minutes.
So you have validated a lot of the things that I've thought about, and I have done various things in the past few years to try to both understand and fight disinformation. I've infiltrated groups of disinformation creators on WhatsApp, on Facebook, to try to understand how they work. Friends have told me to try to fight that. So every time they've spread something false, I have written a message saying that you're trying to create us versus them. And for every lie that they said, I kept putting that. I did that for 3 days until they started branding me with different labels. And
yeah,
I realized
you must have been a real popular guy.
No, and then I saw that, okay, this strategy doesn't really work in the longer term. And then what I realized was that there were 2 kinds of people, or 3 kinds of people: those who believe in science, those who deny science, or those who are trying to create these divides of us versus them, and they are actually doing it in an intentional manner, and those who are kind of misinformed.
Yes.
And what I realized is that you have to distinguish between the types. And
absolutely.
And especially if they are friends and family, because many of them are. And if they are in the disinforming people, intentionally doing something wrong, then when they say that the earth is flat, I say, yes, absolutely right, the earth is flat. I will not argue with them because I know where they're coming from. And I realize that arguing with them does not serve their purpose because they know exactly what they're doing. But if somebody is misinformed and somebody is open to being corrected, then those are the people that you can work with. And I've had at least one success where a person has actually turned around and now calls them the deniers. And it took 3 years for that effort. But it's possible, and it takes time and energy. And to people who said that vaccines do not work, or do you know the long-term side effects of vaccine?
Right.
And then I tell them that, do you know the long-term side effects of COVID? And do you think that we are in a world where we can escape COVID? Sooner or later, you're going to get it. And then there are 2 categories of people. There's a category of people who believe in logic, reasoning, critical thinking. That's all the people in this room. And there are people who debunk all of this, right? Yeah. It's only emotion, emotion and fear of the other that they work on. So how can you fight that people who do not believe in logic with logic? So
Jonathan Swift said, how do you reason somebody out of something they didn't reason themselves into in the first place? And this is the problem, because, and I would maintain that as wonderful as we all are, some of our beliefs are based on identity and emotion as well. We're subject to that. I think the solution to that, although it's not scalable, as you point out, because it takes 3 years maybe with one person, is to build trust. If there are an army of science deniers, there need to be an army of science allies This is what I argue for in my book, How to Talk to a Science Denier. I mean, I went out there and pursued people who were deniers. The last time I was in Pittsburgh, I took a trip up to, forget the name of the county, is it Greene County on the border with West Virginia, and spoke with coal miners, thinking that they were going to be against climate change. Surprise, all the coal miners I spoke with believed in climate change. Yeah. So there is a spectrum. You're absolutely right. There's a spectrum. There are the hardcore people that you can never convince, some of whom you can't convince because they know that what they're doing is a lie. Then there are the people that you're never going to convince for, other reasons. But the persuadables, they're the people that you have to focus on. And there, I think the emphasis, and this was the core argument in my book, think of denial as not just about facts, but about distrust. And showing up in person with a smile, calm, respectful, patient, that's the way to get somebody to trust you. And every single account I've ever read of a hardcore denier who changed their mind always happened in the same way. It was when someone that they trusted, who didn't ridicule them or call them a denier, which is very bad form, took the time and talked them out of their beliefs.
Yes, and I think you hit at something very correct, because you have to say that I disagree with what you say, but I love you for the person you are.
Love is really important in this. I get since I wrote my book, I get heartbreaking letters from people who have family members who are QAnon or Flat Earth, or I hate to keep coming back to that when people think, oh, why worry about them? Who are they hurting? Wait till they start running for your school board like the evolution people did. Did you know that 7% of the population of Brazil believes in Flat Earth? Something like 4% of Americans do, and another 16% say they're not sure. So be careful, right? It creates a culture of denial. They've all changed their mind on the basis of someone. I tell those people who write to me, don't try to convince them, love them. Don't break off with them. Let them know that you are an important part of their life and that your relationship is going to survive any disagreements that you have, and they might come back to you.
Yes, and I rather than arguing, I try to sense if a disagreement is even necessary. And if I see that they are completely committed to whatever, to the flat earth theory, I don't even try to convince them, or don't even try to argue at all.
Sometimes you need to move on.
And the other thing is that if somebody will say that I don't need the vaccine because God will take care of me, then you cannot argue with them with logic. So you have to say that God has sent the vaccine to you. And then God is going to be mad if you don't take it.
Yeah, I've used that. It doesn't work as often as you'd like.
No. So the person told me that she took the vaccine after I told that. And a month later, I asked her that, when are you taking the second dose? And she said, I lied to you because you didn't get off my back. So I didn't take the first dose.
Oh, boy.
So thank you. I'll let other people take questions.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Interesting talk. So I'm Xiaozhong Liu, come from WPI. And before I joined WPI as associate professor, actually, I have been leading the illegal content detection team in a very big company. So I've been working on that for many, many years.
Okay.
And I can provide you some very
I
exciting.
stepped all over your toes there. Please help me.
One good information, one bad information. Good information is all of my efforts in the company are publicly available. We publish the algorithm, we publish the data set.
Okay.
But the sad news is we never win. This is impossible. I'm sorry, I just give you a very sad answer, but this is what I found. Because
why didn't it work though? I mean, the proposal that I've heard from a cognitive scientist named Stephen Lewandowski is that what we really need is radical transparency of the algorithm so that outside experts can see where the harm is likely to come from before we have a whistleblower. But now you're telling me that didn't work when you tried it?
If the goal of your war is to win, is to totally diminishing that, remove the missing disinformation from the web, I can pretty sure, I mean, maybe I'm wrong. Hopefully I'm wrong. Is you won't be able to win.
You'll never get all of it, but I think now I shouldn't quote this in public with somebody recording me because I'm going to get the statistic wrong, but I remember that the election denial on the internet fell
I'm
by
not
some
talking-
enormous percentage after they banned Trump from Twitter. I mean,
I'm-
it does
I'm not
decrease it.
talking about the specific case, but the reason when you moved
Yeah.
Donald Trump from Twitter and the Truth Social, I remember called Truth Social exist, and the
Yeah.
popularity of
But it's
Newsmax goes
not
up.
as popular.
So that's I mean statistically, I just say statistically, people are very creative when they
Look,
diffuse such
you're
information.
right. I mean,
statistically,
they will
statistically.
find another outlet, but it's not the same. I mean, not all outlets are created equal. Twitter is huge megaphone. Truth Social, not even close.
One Twitter, I just say once again, statistically, when
Yeah.
Twitter remove all such information, the popularity of another social platform can goes up dramatically. So I'm just talking about something statistically. I mean,
Yeah.
when I was working with like a pornography, for example, information diffusion, but the company, of course, don't allow me to publish the result because of the privacy reason. But I can see very sad is the user, they're very creative when they diffuse such information. And when you block one way, another more creative way, more effective way gonna show up. So I personally don't think if the goal of the war is to win, then highly likely you will disappoint.
I think you're probably right. It's an
Some
it's
other
a
way.
never-ending battle. But if we didn't, it's like when I used to work at the Federal Reserve and I did an article on counterfeiting, and I interviewed a Secret Service agent. He said, "We build a 10-foot wall, they build an 11-foot ladder." But if you don't keep going, then what happens, right? You have to keep figuring out.
I mean, we can keep going. We find a way to make things a little bit better.
Yes.
But I'm still believing if this is the war, the
Yes.
goal should not just totally
the war
win.
will never be over, is what you're saying. Look, I've interviewed people in the military and in intelligence. They will tell me the same thing. This is an ongoing war, and yet they continue to fight it. They have ways that we're not using now to fight in the disinformation war. But I think sadly you're right. It will never be over. Yeah.
7 more minutes for Q&A.
All right. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Devin. I'm from the University of Missouri. I'm about to graduate, so I'm about to enter this world.
Okay.
And first of all, thank you for your talk. It's been illuminating. My area is information literacy, and I also am a huge Indiana Jones fan, so I really liked your example.
Oh,
at the
good.
beginning. But I think you left out a really important part of that scene
Okay.
of what happens when you choose wrong. And
Okay.
focusing on
I don't remember the scene well enough.
Oh, say, okay. So you are not sci-fi fans like me.
Well,
when
I'm
you
old, so I have a bad memory.
When you choose in that scene, Indiana Jones used his archaeological knowledge to choose the correct grail.
Yes.
The Nazi that went before him chose wrong and
Right.
drank from the wrong cup because he had the wrong facts or the wrong truth, however you want to describe it. Anyway, I don't want to take up too much time,
Wrong
but
motives.
he met his demise because of that decision. So that makes me think about the ultimate victims are the people who are the consumers of the information. So the people who get misinformed, and
That's
you
right.
talked about that a bit. So I guess my question to you is you focused on I really liked your three-pronged approach to talking about the problem, the creation, the amplification, and the uptake. But I'd love to hear a little tidbit about the uptake for somebody like me, who's an information literacy educator. How do I, what does that part of the solution look like? Because I think I agree that, yes, we can attack amplification, but I think uptake is probably ultimately in the long term more important. So I'd just like to hear your thoughts on that.
I think you're right. Before I came over here, literally 2 minutes before I came into this room, I heard a talk on resilience, which was a very good information resilience, which is a very good talk. And I think that one thing that we can do to keep people, if you try to debunk after somebody has already heard the misinformation and maybe already believes it, then you're always fighting catch up. But if there's some way to make people more resilient before, so that they're less susceptible to it. That's good. There's in concert with the Bache and Schmidt study that I talked about before, there was one by Sander van der Linden, who's maybe the leading expert in the world, along with Lewandowski and John Cook, on pre-bunking. It's called inoculation theory. How can you develop a set of critical thinking skills by which people can learn how to navigate in an environment in which they're going to be subjected to propaganda, disinformation, whatever you want to call it. And I think that that's a very promising thing, right? So that, I mean, literally, it's like a vaccine, right? I talked about talking to people once they were already infected during the infodemic, like it's salvage, they're already sick, you know, but you remove the pump handle. Pre-bunking is removing the pump handle. Pre-bunking is saying, I'm going to keep you from the vector that's going to make you sick, because you're going to have this set of skills that's going to keep you from doing that. So, and I mean, I saw a couple of poster presentations talking about resilience. I'd like to learn more about it. I mean, the idea of resilience seems to me to be very important in this.
Thank you.
Shannon Altman, the University of Kentucky, and
Yes,
I think you were
we
at
just-
our, yes.
And you've
So
got
you
your,
can,
so
you can probably
I
guess.
asked a question at yours, and now you've got me right where you want me. So
You
go
can
ahead.
probably guess the
I know what your
tack I will
question's going to
take.
be.
I would like you to address the complexity and nuance of looking at moderation of amplification and uptake.
Yeah.
There's a big difference between a beheading video and some vaccine misinformation. There's a big difference between somebody who has 22 million followers and makes a mistake versus somebody who has, say, 10,000 followers and deliberately spreads disinformation. So I didn't hear a lot of nuance in your answer. And I think there is a lot more nuance that needs to be looked at.
I think you're right. And by the way, what I wish I had said more about, especially results of just sitting in on your panel, is that I really mean it at the end when I say that refusing to amplify disinformation is not censorship. That the problem is when you decide, you know, I think this is a values question. We have to ask, who is entitled to have their message spread to the world? And does it matter who they are? Does it matter what the message is? Does it matter whether it's true? Does it matter whether they believe it's true? And the analogy that I think of sometimes is, we have, say there's a hate group that wanted to have a parade, and we hate this hate group. We don't want them to have the parade because their message is horrible. But we might think, yes, but in a free society, they should have a right to have their parade, but I'm going to go protest what they're going to say. Okay, that's an open, free society. But ask yourself this question. You don't want to censor the speech, even if you hate what they're saying. But ask yourself this question. Does that mean that you're required to help them hand out leaflets to their parade to get more people to come and listen to their message? No, that's different. Refusing to amplify disinformation is not censorship. I think that deplatforming, one problem with the way that the social media companies have handled it is they've taken down the messages. They're not targeting the liars. And that's one thing that I've learned from talking to my friends in the military. They go after most of the disinformation that they deal with is by serial liars. And if you can deplatform the liars, then it's more effective. We've got so much more to talk about. I really enjoyed your panel. And now I'm going to hear more
I was
about
the
it.
other person on the panel. My
I
name's
know.
Emily Knox, and I'm an associate professor at the School of Information Sciences at University of Illinois. I think my question is really, who is making the decision that something is disinformation? And how do you pull that apart from other systemic issues in our world?
Yeah.
So you talk about science in a way that, like, science has this truthfulness to it. But when I think about science, for example, I think about the history of gynecology and the way that enslaved women were tortured to forward this, this part of science. I just don't know that science is without everything else within our systems. When I think about election denial, to me, that's really about white supremacy. It's not actually about denying elections. It's actually about maintaining certain social structures. And so who is making these decisions?
Well, we've got a problem though, don't we? Because you and I agree that what election denial is about is not really about elections. But who decides that? And what do we do when someone who believes that the 2020 election was stolen says, well, why do you guys get to decide? And yet there is a truth behind this, right? It may be different, and I'm a philosopher, so I get a lot of heat from my colleagues, believe me, for standing up for the idea of truth, especially in science. I get it, okay? What I'm saying is somewhat controversial. But I do think that there is a truth of the matter, whether we know it or not. And that truth, hiding that truth does often hurt people who are marginalized, hurt people who have not otherwise had a voice. I think of the Flint water crisis. Who suffers from that, in that instance, right? So when somebody attacks science and says that, well, scientific knowledge is merely an assertion of power, there is no such thing as objective truth. Tell that to the people who live in Flint, Michigan, who are drinking water that had lead in it. Science is not perfect. And in my book, Scientific Attitude, I take them to task for fraud and things short of fraud, et cetera. But the analogy I want to use here is this. Who decides whether something is disinformation? Who gets to decide that? I could ask the same question about who gets to decide what's fraud in science or not. Scientists do. Scientists decide whether something is fraud as a community, not the individual who did it. But there is the scientific attitude, I think, is an ethos, a community-wide ethos, in which scientists decide that, the worst sin you can do in science is to commit fraud. And if they can't reproduce your results, that's bad. But if they can't reproduce your results and they find out that it's, because you committed fraud, you're basically out. How do we do that kind of thing with disinformation? I'm not sure I can give a perfect answer to that. But the thing that haunts me about this is there is a truth about whether the vaccines cause infertility. There is a truth about whether there are microchips in them, or even whether Gates had patent 666. It's just a nesting doll of lies. There is a truth to all these matters. And just because it's difficult to figure out what that truth is, doesn't mean that we need to open up the airwaves or the internet for all comers to say anything they want, and the truth will rise to the top. Because the experience I've had is that the truth does not rise to the top. The truth is behind. The truth plays catch up. And the people and we all get hurt by that, I think. Again, I want to follow up with you guys and talk about this more. This is why I'm here.
Thank you so much, Dr. Lee McIntyre, for this fascinating talk. Thank you.
You need me to do something there for you, right?
No, and as we talked, when you and I end too. So thank you, Dr. Lee. And now we will begin with, so you could go and.
Oh, I thought I was going to do the drawing here so that you would know it was not.
Okay.
You don't want it to be rigged, do you?
No, you can do it. I'll just mix it. You could do the drawing. Yes. So then.
Yeah, so you're just going to pick out your favorite person.
Yes. So the winner will receive a $100 refund of the registration fee raffle.
Wait a minute. No. Sarah Rotger.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Lee. So thank you so much, everyone, for all your patience and participation and for creating this conference and for making it wonderful. And hope you all enjoy the conference and do have a safe trip back home. So thank you, everyone. And with that, the session is adjourned.